Welcome to Inner Compass. I'm Karen Saupe. The Declaration of Independence guarantees a host of freedoms, but as we watch the economic freedom of some people come at the expense of others, many Americans are wondering how these ideals can be applied more fairly. Today's guest is sure it's possible. Join us on Inner Compass.
From the campus of Calvin College, this is Inner Compass, exploring how people use faith and ethics to guide them through critical issues of today.
My guest today is Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research and former professor of business and government policy. Dr. Brooks has written several books investigating the connections among culture, politics, and economic life in America. Welcome, Arthur.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Give me an idealistic vision of what free enterprise looks like in a perfect world.
Well, a free enterprise system, generally speaking, doesn't exist, we believe, in a perfect world because, people are fallen and we're not perfect people and there aren't really any perfect circumstances. But the free enterprise system is one that relies on private markets, it relies on private responsibility, it relies on limited government, and it relies on property rights and the rule of law. It fundamentally relies on people's thirst for freedom and individual opportunity and a celebration of the entrepreneurial system, where entrepreneurship is a central institution in our economy, as opposed to many other countries where government is a central institution in the economy.
How does the Constitution provide for free enterprise?
The Constitution provides for the free enterprise system insofar as it talks very, very strongly about the whole concept of freedom. I should say the ideas of the founders more than the laws that are set out in the parameters of the Constitution. When we talk about what the founding fathers saw, what they talked about in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, how do you live that? Well, these were before the Industrial Revolution, and so the capitalist system hadn't developed to the extent that we see it today, not even close. Right. But how do you live the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And the answer is that we're able to to earn our own success, to find meaning as we see it, to control our own existence to the extent that it's possible to do so and it's responsible to do so. Now, reasonable people disagree about how the government gets involved in all that, but the free enterprise system is the living manifestation of expanded liberty or expanding liberty, of individual opportunity as opposed to equal incomes and group rights, and entrepreneurship as a central cultural institution in America.
What do you see as the ideal government role in controlling free enterprise or in supporting the freedoms that we ought to have?
Well, the ideal government role that's a difficult thing to say because it depends on the circumstances and it depends on the times, it depends on the challenges that we have at hand. But I have to say that the non-ideal government role is one in which the government is actually creating market failures. Which it did in the last crisis. I know for sure what the non-ideal government role is at this point.
Some people would argue that the government problem was that there was too little regulation.
Sure. Now, what the genesis of the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009 was a housing crisis. What happened was that there were too many people who were not creditworthy, that were getting too many loans that they couldn't pay. And when they started to default, so did the institutions that lent the money, and then so did organizations that had insured the value of those loans, and basically the whole system went down. Now, the question is, why were so many people who were not creditworthy getting so much money to buy houses that they couldn't afford and that they were so willing to walk away from? And the answer to that is government. There were two institutions called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac that are government-sponsored enterprises that everybody knew that the government would backstop if they got into trouble, that were making loans, that were buying up loans that were made under subprime conditions, which is to say, to people who were not creditworthy. What that was doing, it was dramatically expanding the number of mortgages that were being made to people that were very, very likely to default on their mortgages. In fact, in 2007, among the people who defaulted early on their mortgages, there's evidence that up to 70% of the applications among those people contained fraud. There's also evidence that the vast majority of people who walked away from these mortgages could actually afford to stay in their homes, but it was simply a bad deal to do so. But fundamentally, at its core, the financial crisis that we had was provoked by bad government policy, which created the incentives for the free enterprise system, or rather some institutions within the free enterprise system, to get into trouble and to get the rest of our economy into trouble. So we need to understand fundamentally how the government and how the capitalist system work together, and how they work together poorly in many cases in a way that conspires against the general public, like it did in this case.
So what you're saying there is that people made sleazy choices because they knew that the government would bail them out.
Sure.
And so the implication there is that if government weren't involved, people would have to take the high road?
No, what it says is that when people are responsible for the consequences of their own actions, they tend not to take so many risks with other people's money.
Okay.
Now, what I'm saying is basically that the government created the conditions, and Main Street did a lot of stuff that it shouldn't have done.
Right.
And so did Wall Street, because Wall Street started getting involved in these low, these poor mortgage, these poor risk markets in the same way that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac did. So it's not as if Wall Street wasn't to blame. It's not even as if Main Street wasn't to blame. Everybody was to blame, but the conditions were set actually by bad government policy. And so when the government is actually wrecking markets as opposed to helping markets, that's the exact opposite. And then the great irony is that the government officials today, including the President of the United States, turn around and say that it's the markets themselves that are at fault, as opposed to the entity that set off the whole problem.
But you've just said that everyone's to blame. I mean,
sure.
So you're saying at the same time that everyone's to blame, but that somehow you place the primary blame on the government.
Well, the government officials today say that everybody's to blame except the government.
Okay, well,
and Main Street. And the truth of the matter is that there was a lot of bad behavior, and that lot of bad behavior was facilitated by poor government policy.
So creating sort of crutches for people, is that I mean.
Well, you're asking whether or not there should be a safety net, whether or not there should be basic standards, whether or not how much we should look out for the vulnerable. And I'm as sympathetic as anybody else to the idea that we should be helping the vulnerable. Now, the disagreement in the American economy, of course, is the extent to which we as individuals should be doing those things versus coercing each other to do so through the government. And those are really legitimate disagreements, because that's how you set up a society that's supposed to be fair and that's supposed to be just and it's supposed to be humane. I do believe that we have gone a significant portion down the road significantly toward a society in which we crowd out our individual private responsibility to help each other because of the expectation that the state will be there in the breach. That's certainly what's happened in Western Europe.
I do think it has to do with whether we view the government as us, that is, as the representatives we've elected to do our will as a people, or if we view the government as them, those people who have gone to Washington and lost their heads or something. And so, yeah, it's hard for me to see what government does as not. I see government as an agency, as an agent of my will. Well, ideally, right? And so, but in either case, you're saying yes, we have a responsibility to look out for the vulnerable.
Sure. I mean, we certainly do so. Most people who follow normal Judeo-Christian traditions believe that to be the case, and these are even secular ethics. I mean, this is not a religious issue at all. Most people believe that we have a duty to help people who are less fortunate than we are. The question is, how do we do it? How do we do it best? And how do we do it in a way that protects the dignity and autonomy of the very people that we're trying to help? There's a lot of evidence that the ways that we've done it over the past several decades with big government solutions has not helped the very people that we're trying to help, and it's done a whole lot of damage to the way that we understand ourselves as problem solvers. And you know, that's not just a free enterprise problem, that's a happiness problem, ultimately, that we're getting into. Now, you mentioned a minute ago that it would be good if the government were an agent of our will. There is increasing evidence that the government, when it comes to free enterprise, is not an agent of the American will. There's a lot of evidence and increasing discontent among the American population in the way that which the government is growing itself and the way it's constricting the circumstances under which free enterprise organizations can exist and they can thrive. 70% of Americans believe that the free market is the best way to organize the American economy, despite severe ups and downs.
Yes.
These are data collected in the spring of 2009, the worst part of the recession, by the Pew Research Center, which is not an ideological organization. When 70% of Americans agree with that, yet the 30% who don't are in charge of increasing the size of government, you have a very major cultural shift on your hands, and in my view, a significant problem.
And we do have an American spirit of freedom that drives. I mean, I might ask initially, why is it that socialism is just inherently a bad word in America? Because that wasn't true 100 years ago. I mean, there was a sort of contest of ideals at that point, I think, but we seem pretty certain about this.
Yeah, we are. The trouble is that our leaders are not. We are, as Americans, overwhelmingly certain that we want a free enterprise system. The trouble is that we're willing to let government officials who are not sure of this idea, we're willing to let them socialize our losses, which is to say, give us some bailouts, because bailouts are nice.
Is that what it is? Is it selfishness? I mean, because we're not intentionally electing a socialist leadership, and yet I mean, to defend government leaders who feel that, yeah, we have to do what we have to give a leg up to the poor. The idea of everyone having equal opportunity is such a wonderful and perfect idea, except that it doesn't work in today's world. There are too many deeply poor people who don't have the fundamental opportunities. My grandfather came over a little over 100 years ago, 18 years old, with nothing in his pockets and very little training. And he made a go of it, and he did well, as did many of his peers. I don't see people doing that today.
Well, there are lots and lots of people who are doing fine and who have relatively little. The most income mobile group in the American population today are people who work in the bottom quintile of the income distribution. Those are the people who are most likely to rise. Now, of course, they can't fall, so you know, in one direction to go. But it's also true that people who are in that bottom income quintile who don't work are the least likely to do anything. They're the most likely to stay where they are. And so in point of fact, we have two groups in America today. We have the working poor and the non-working poor. One is really income mobile and one is really stuck. And so the two competing narratives about America, that you can do anything you want if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you're poor, you're stuck, both are correct. But we're talking about two different groups of people, and that means we have two different kinds of public policy challenges. What the data tell us over the past several years, or the past couple of generations actually, is that the main reason that the non-working poor are demobilized is precisely because we've demobilized them by guaranteeing them their income. I mean, the best thing that we ever did for the non-working poor was welfare reform in the mid-1990s, where we asked people to work. It pulled millions of people out of poverty so that they could be more like your grandfather. Sure. Basically, that's the promise of work. That's the promise of vocation. Ultimately, if we do things right, that's the promise of the free enterprise system. Now, it's tough, because there are a lot of cases where you say, yeah, but it seems so inhumane to toss people out there and ask them to work. And this is all very abstract. I mean, we don't have a poor person sitting here saying, yes, but I can't find a job. And I'm very, very sympathetic to those things. That's when policy design has to be carefully done. That's when we have to take into account the fact that there are particular difficulties and not every case is the same. But that notwithstanding, we can't forget our principles. Our principles are that for you and me, we believe that free enterprise is good enough for us. We want to face the consequences of our actions, the vicissitudes of modern life, because that's how we can earn our success. And what's good enough for us should be good enough for everybody. If we believe that that's a great thing for us, we should have the fortitude and the generosity to say that that's good for everybody, and let's find a way to make that not a hollow promise.
What would that look like, though? What sorts of policies could we put in place that would, I mean, yes, welfare reform was helpful because it incentivized seeking work. Not everybody can work.
Sure, not everybody can. There are lots of cases in which people are too ill to work, and those are the cases in which we actually have to figure out how we as a society actually do want to support people. But we're very, very far away from dealing with just those cases. Today we're dealing with how are we going to support Chrysler? Today we're saying how are we going to bail out AIG? What are we going to do to make sure that people who walked away from their mortgages could stay in their homes? This is an entirely different scale of statism. Right. You know, if we were only dealing with what should we do with the mentally ill, I would be very, very pleased, instead of what should we be doing with incompetent auto executives who've had their throats slit by the United Auto Workers. This is simply not the level of statism that's even remotely comparable to how should we deal with the poor.
What do you think we can do now, given the situations that we find ourselves in, I would argue that government can't simply walk away from it because too much of a mess has been made. But how do we fix it?
To fix the current economic crisis?
Yeah. In 20 words or less.
Absolutely. To begin with, we have to recognize that what we've been doing up to this point has not been effective largely. I mean, the stimulus package that we have, for example, spending hundreds of billions of dollars, has largely been done as a pretext to move us toward a more of a system of social engineering. And it has been used as an opportunity to create earmarks and pork for politicians. That's basically what the stimulus package has been all about. And if you don't believe it, you just look at the legislation. You look at any of the recent legislation. Anytime you find a bill that's 2,000 pages, the reason is because these are like pieces of software. If you have too much code in the software, it's trying to hide something.
Sure.
It's trying to hide malware, which is what engineers call something that will get onto your computer, a Trojan that will get into your computer and do something that you don't want. That's what all of this stuff is basically doing. So the first step is actually going back and saying, what were we trying to do?
Right.
We were actually trying to get the American economy back on track, and that's not what this legislation has done. It's taken us, it's been culture-changing legislation as opposed to economy-saving legislation. So we need to go back and pull up the bad stuff by its roots and try again. Or not, because it looks like we're actually on the mend at this point, yet we still have a ton of stimulus spending still to go that's going to change our culture even more. So to begin with, let's go back and say, what were our ambitions? What do we want as a people? How much of what we've done so far can we actually, and how much should we actually cancel? And that would be a good place to start.
So you feel like not maybe that there should never have been a bailout, but that moving forward from the bailout could be accomplished in different ways?
Well, there's bailouts and there's stimulus. Those are two different sets of policies. Bailouts were basically, we're going to go to financial institutions, we're going to try not to let the pain that they're undergoing spread to more Americans around the country, and economists are really divided on whether or not we should have done that. I mean, deeply, deeply divided on how we should have done it and whether we should have done it. But on the stimulus package, it's a pretty responsible position at this point, to say that the stimulus, as we've understood it, did very little to stimulate the American economy and is going to do a world of hurt to our opportunities particularly over the next 10 and 20 years.
Going back then to the bailout idea, I sort of felt like, from a moral standpoint, I thought the bailout was wrong, that we deserved to suffer the consequences of our mistakes, and yet that would have entailed my suffering the consequences of someone else's mistakes, and therefore I was glad that the government was there to
sure.
To
no. I mean,
me, right?
and basically, that's why it was such a big opportunity for our current leaders. It was a big opportunity. What they want to do basically is. Bailouts are great. What they are the socialization of losses. This is how you get more of a sharing economy. This is how you get more social democracy. You socialize losses through bailouts, and then you have to socialize gains through redistribution. There's simply no other way that you can do it, and this is how we actually change the Americans from their sort of retro, inconvenient orientation toward free enterprise toward one that looks toward the state for more goods and services. The current financial crisis is a big game changer culturally, to change the rules of the game that we say, to change our attitudes, to shift our culture.
Will a free market economy create jobs during a recession?
It will. I mean, the free market economy always creates jobs. The question is whether or not it's going to create enough jobs that there's not too much pain for us to bear. The free market will come to the rescue. It always has and it always will. What we have to decide is whether or not it does so fast enough and successfully enough in the time frame that mitigates the pain enough for us.
How do you facilitate that? How do you make it easy for the market to do what it needs to do? And there must be no shortage of ideas. In Michigan, the idea is that if we're going to save the economy, we've got to find new industries and we've got to find new ways to generate jobs and income. And I sometimes wonder, are we just, does that entail creating needs that people don't really have? Do we have to make people think they want something that they don't really need? Or can it be, they're looking at energy, alternative sources of energy. Could be a very creative way. Michigan is looking at bringing more movies, making more movies, and that's not enough to save the whole state, but it sure helps. But does the world need more movies? Or do we have to create jobs, and do we have to create a sense of desire?
Well, the single best way to help the economy recover is to get out of people's way. You know, economists like me would like everybody to believe that the only way that you can save an economy is to give jobs to economists like me. And so the really technical stuff that we do, you need us to be, with our green eye shades on and, come up with these policies. That's all nonsense. You want to get out of any recession, the way you do it is with hard work and entrepreneurship. Just like our grandparents, just like your grandfather knew, and like if we do our jobs, our grandchildren will know. Hard work and entrepreneurship are the key, and you don't need any kind of advanced degree to understand that. We have the second highest corporate tax rate in the developed world in this country. You want a job killer? That's it. So do you want to bring more attractive investment to the United States? Let's have at least a corporate tax rate that's competitive with our allies. I mean, we're not even competitive with Sweden. Everybody thinks Sweden's a socialist country. They look like a progressive capitalist state compared to the United States.
In terms of corporate tax?
Corporate taxes. Our progressive tax system. We have a very progressive tax system, and we're trying to increase the progressivity of our tax system. Mr. Obama goes on and on about how the rich need to pay their fair share, and he talks about it from a really moral standpoint. But we're changing the incentives of people to start businesses, to create growth and jobs here, and people are going to do less. We've got the data. People will do less.
The incentives to be creative, to take risks, to grow, so forth, are always greed, that everyone wants to get rich. And not everyone does care about getting rich, I think. I mean, there are other incentives for being creative. There are other incentives. You were a musician. You know that there are things you do because you love to do them and not because you expect to get rich.
Sure, and the people who exemplify that best are entrepreneurs. I've done a lot of research on the motivations of entrepreneurship in this country, and you find that the least materialistic people in the American economy are actually entrepreneurs. Now, ironically, entrepreneurs often get really, really rich, but the money is beside the point. So we talk about incentives as if they're all about the money, but they're not. What they are about is giving people the opportunity to earn their success, not to be given a government handout, not to win the lottery, not to get an inheritance, but to earn their own success. Now, money generally comes along for the ride, but you have to create the incentives where people actually can earn their own success, and expropriating the rewards from that success so they can't grow their businesses, so they can't afford to hire more people, so they can't become more successful, short circuits that whole process. This is not a materialistic claim, but you can't take away the rewards. This is the irony.
What would keep people from making immoral decisions? What would keep people from putting all their money in a Swiss bank account to avoid taxes? What would keep people from just sheer greed and exploitation?
Well, there are two big ways to solve the greed and exploitation problem. There's one critically important one that we can't do without, and there's one that can help that first institution. That first institution that we can't live without is not the government. It's our hearts. You simply cannot get a well-functioning capitalist system without good moral character. That is absolutely the case. Anybody who thinks that moral character doesn't matter is dead wrong. And all you have to do is, wake up in the morning and look around to find that markets can fail because people act in immoral ways. But that's not necessarily a call for more government. That's a call for a more serious understanding of our obligation to hold ourselves to high moral standards. That's a call for parenting and talking about ethics in our schools and actually holding ourselves in business relations to a higher ethical standard. Now, government does have a role. Anybody who thinks that we shouldn't have any government is also living in a fantasy land. You need some regulation. There are lots of cases where markets are going to fail because people don't have good information, where there tends to be monopolies, where we have public goods that we want to provide, or where one entity tends to harm another, either inadvertently or on purpose, or where just these moral standards don't stand up and we need some backstop, or we need laws. Everybody knows that we need some laws so that we can keep from harming each other, but the principal institution has to be our own particular set of ethics, and we have to hold ourselves to a higher ethical standard. This is something that in the free enterprise movement, we don't understand well enough, that there's an inseparability of our hearts with our wallets. Then the day that we don't understand it is the day that the government will step into the breach, and that will be a very slippery slope towards statism, and it will be bad for our hearts, and it will be bad for our free enterprise.
So you really see the success of free enterprise as deeply connected to our willingness to be adults and to be responsible, to be morally mature.
That is absolutely the case. I mean, the success of our families relies on that. The success of our being good neighbors relies on that. And like our family lives and our community life, our free enterprise system is a cultural phenomenon. And it's only as successful as we are successful as people, that we are successful as moral beings. It is part of a social system. You know, we tend to think about free enterprise as an economic alternative, like socialism or, you know, capitalism and socialism, economic alternatives. Free enterprise is not just an economic alternative. It's the bedrock of American culture today. We lose it at our peril because we lose a little bit of our special souls when we take away our economic freedom. Economic activity is not about the money. Economic activity is an expressive thing. You know, money in an already rich country is actually not about the money. It's who we are as people. It's what we do all day. It's our vocation. 89% of Americans are either satisfied or very satisfied with their jobs, and they spend a lot of their hours doing it. Your soul is bound up with what you're doing to earn your daily bread. If we reduce that to a bunch of monetary transactions and govern it simply through the state and exempt ourselves from it, boy, that's a really depressing place. I don't want to be there.
My guest today has been Arthur Brooks, president of the American Enterprise Institute for Public Policy Research. I'm Karen Saupe. Thank you for watching Inner Compass.